2 weeks after the murder of Mark Kilroy, the cult prepared to perform what would be known as their last known ritual. It was to serve the purpose of a sacrificial offering for a major shipment of marijuana, which would also be their last major shipment before the authorities closed in on them. It was also deeply personal for Sara because their victim was her former boyfriend, Sosa. He was also either a former member or active member of the drug ring. On the 28th of March that year, Sosa was abducted and killed in a grisly ritual. His blood was used to seal the cult's final major shipment of marijuana. It's believed Sara approved the selection of Sosa as the victim and took an active role in the ritual. It was both an act of spiritual necessity and personal transformation, symbolically severing her ties to her former life. The drugs made it across, but the cult's world was now unraveling. Days later, law enforcement raided Rancho Santa Elena, uncovering mass graves and launching a nationwide manhunt. By the end of her descent, Sara was no longer the honor student from Brownsville. She had transformed into a woman who spoke in chants, interpreted entrails, and gave spiritual justification for murder. Each crime served a purpose: power, protection, purification, but also marks the erosion of her humanity. She believed in the rituals, she commanded them, she justified them. Her crimes weren't just about blood, they were about control, faith, and the illusion of invincibility. And with everybody that fell at her feet, she walked deeper into the abyss, a willing disciple of death. The investigation into Constanzo's cult and Sara's role in the Matamoros ritual killings is one of the most complex and chilling criminal probes in modern Mexican history. What began as a missing persons case quickly unraveled into a discovery of ritual murder, occultism, and cartel-linked violence. However, the investigation was anything but straightforward. Mexican and US authorities encountered major cultural, bureaucratic, and criminal limitations every step of the way. On the 14th of March 1989, in Matamoros, Mexico, the investigation began not with the cult but with the mysterious disappearance of Mark Kilroy, the 21-year-old pre-med student from the University of Texas. He had crossed the border into Matamoros during spring break with friends. One moment he was outside a bar, the next he was gone. His disappearance quickly attracted attention because he wasn't a local, he was Anglo, and his family had connections, including an uncle in the US Customs. They demanded answers and pushed both US and Mexican authorities to act. However, this was easier said than done, because Matamoros at the time was a place riddled with corruption, drug trafficking, and police inefficiency. The area had seen more than 60 disappearances since January of that year alone. Most of them were just simply ignored or attributed to cartel violence, and the case was shut. If Kilroy hadn't been an American, his case may have been buried like the rest. When local Mexican authorities failed to produce leads, the United States law enforcement stepped in, including the DEA, US Customs, and the FBI. The Mexican police, under such pressure, began rounding up suspects and questioning known criminals using controversial techniques. The Mexican authorities beat their suspects. They were beaten, starved, and forced to inhale hot sauce-laced carbonated water through their noses. The problem with this approach was that while this brutal interrogation process occasionally yielded leads, the torture-based methods made many confessions inadmissible or unreliable, limiting the judicial follow-through. However, one breakthrough came not from an interrogation but from an accident. On the 1st of April, a nephew of drug lord Elio Hernandez blew through a routine checkpoint outside Matamoros in his truck. Due to this, the officers gave chase, and instead of fleeing into town, 20-year-old Serafin drove directly to Rancho Santa Elena, the cult's ritual site. A brief search by the police turned up marijuana, ritual objects, and evidence of occult activity. They arrested Serafin and another man, David Serna Valdez, Under question, Seraphin freely confessed. He admitted the cult had murdered Mark Kilroy and many others as human sacrifices. He explained that the killings were part of their religion, a belief system rooted in Palo Mayombe and Santería, manipulated by Constanzo to ensure protection for their drug-smuggling activities. He revealed the nickname of their leader, El Padrino, and named Sara Aldrete as La Madrina. The problem here was the nature of these confessions, talking about magic, protection from bullets, and sacrificing humans, was so bizarre that many authorities had trouble believing it. Some initially dismissed it as the ramblings of mentally ill criminals. 8 days later, on April 9, following through on the information they received from Seraphin, they brought Seraphin to the ranch. There, he pointed to a specific spot and began to dig. It didn't take long before they unearthed Mark Kilroy's mutilated body. Between the 11th to 17th of April, with Seraphin still in custody, the police returned to Rancho Santa Elena and began excavating the areas. What they found stunned even the most hardened officers. Police found 15 mutilated bodies in shallow graves, a nganga or ritual cauldron as it's called, containing blood, bones and brain, eventually found to belong to Mark Kilroy. There were human remains mixed with animal parts, clear evidence of torture, sodomy and ritual dismemberment. This was no ordinary cartel massacre. It was methodical, religiously coded and ceremonial. News of the discovery exploded internationally. Around the 13th of April, a service was being planned in hope of Mark's safe return, but sadly this would become a memorial service instead, as his remains had now been found. Mark's family were forgiving towards their son's murderers and asked the public to pray for them, so that in the event that they died, they could go to heaven and apologize for Mark for their actions. The authorities hired a curandero, known as a folk healer, to purify the shack. Afterwards, they burnt it to ashes. This reportedly drove Constanzo into a rage, as it meant a lot to him. The police, in search of the cult members, raided several properties belonging to Constanzo located as far as Houston, Texas, where they uncovered homosexual pornography, ritualistic paraphernalia including candles. They also raided Sara's home, where likewise they found a ritualistic shrine, religious images, and the whole house was covered in blood. But Constanzo, Sara, and other top cult members had vanished as the investigation closed in. They fled to Mexico City, hiding in a series of safe houses with help from followers. Authorities believed they might try to flee to the US or Miami, where Constanzo had roots, but they stayed put, growing increasingly paranoid and volatile. Mexico City was vast and law enforcement was overwhelmed by false sightings, rumors, and media pressure. Constanzo was allegedly spotted in Chicago, Miami, and even the Vatican, distracting their resources. It's said that on the 2nd of May, while hiding in a Mexico City apartment, Sara Aldrete wrote a desperate note which read, "Please call the judicial police. A woman is being held hostage. I beg for this." She tossed the note out the window, but the man who found it thought it was a joke, an unfortunate delay that allowed the cult more time to regroup. I'm not sure what her plan was or how this was meant to help her, as she herself was one of the main people the police were looking for. Four days later, the police would find Constanzo. Ironically, the police weren't even looking for Constanzo when they found him. They were investigating an unrelated missing child and knocking on doors in that neighborhood. When Constanzo saw police from his window, he panicked and opened fire, revealing his location. A massive shootout ensued. Over 180 officers surrounded the building. Constanzo, knowing it was over, handed his weapon to cultivist Alvaro El Dubi de Leon Valdez and ordered El Dubi to kill him and Martin Quintana, his fellow member and closest disciple. El Dubi obeyed. Constanzo died as he lived, in control. The police stormed the apartment and arrested Sara Aldrete, Alvaro de Leon Valdez, and another member, Omar Oria. Others in the cult, including members of the Hernandez family, were captured in the weeks that followed. The police recovered ritual items, documents of Constanzo's personal journals, which detailed spells, customers' names, and sacrifices. Just as well as the criminal cartel were all captured and the cult was brought to an end. However, this wasn't an easy feat. From the 14th of March to the 6th of May, in about 6 to 8 weeks, the syndicate was brought down. However, so accidentally while investigating other supposedly unrelated crimes. The officials were limited as many Mexican law enforcement officials were on the cartel's payroll, and some at the time or another had even been members of Constanzo's cult. They leaked information, destroyed evidence, and hampered the early stages of the investigation. To worsen matters, the involvement of Santería and Palo Mayombe complicated the case. Many officers had no knowledge of Afro-Caribbean religions and struggled to separate legitimate religious practices from twisted cult adaptations. Mexico's legal system at the time had limited capacity for prosecuting ritualistic crimes, and confessions extracted by force, procedural errors, and jurisdictional confusion delayed trials. Fortunately, with the limitations posed by the Mexican authorities, the American officials demanded justice for Kilroy, which increased pressure on the Mexico's government, but it also led to hurried arrests and botched chain of custody procedures. After the blood-soaked curtain had fallen on Constanzo's reign of terror, Mexico was left with a burning question. What do you do when your legal system must reckon with a crime so grotesque, so unprecedented, that it defies both law and comprehension? The surviving members of the Matamoros death cult were taken into custody, but their trials would become a test not only of justice, but of Mexico's legal infrastructure, which was woefully unprepared for the unique challenges this case presented. The Mexican authorities scrambled to bring immediate charges. The cult members were held under Mexico's arraigo system, which is a form of pre-trial detention that allows suspects to be held without formal charges while investigators gather evidence. The initial charges included homicide, criminal association, kidnapping, assaulting a police officer, drug trafficking, and illegal possession of weapons. The case of Sara Aldrete in particular posed a legal curiosity. On paper, she was a college student with no prior criminal record, yet she had now been tossed into the center of Mexico's most heinous occult murder case. Sara at first portrayed herself as a victim, not a perpetrator. In early interviews, she claimed she had been kidnapped by Constanzo, held hostage, and forced to participate in the rituals. She pointed to the note she had thrown out the windows days before the shootout as proof of her desperation. But investigators and later prosecutors quickly discovered inconsistencies. Aldrete had been too involved, too high-ranking, and too knowledgeable about the rituals. She had appeared on cult documents, directed followers, and been mentioned in Constanzo's journals as La Madrina, his chosen successor. In a bit more detail in Sara's interrogation, especially as she was the second in command. When Sara, also known as La Madrina, was arrested, following the dramatic shootout that ended in the death of cult leader Constanzo, the Mexican authorities believed they had finally captured the second in command of one of the most sadistic and bizarre criminal organizations in Mexican history. But what unfolded in the interrogation room over the following days was not just a confession. It was a disturbing performance of denial, manipulation, psychological duality, and spiritual rationalization. Sara was no ordinary suspect. She was an educated, bilingual, articulate college student with no prior criminal history. She had once been listed in Who's Who at Texas Southmost College, and yet she stood accused of participating in ritual human sacrifice, drug trafficking, murder, and criminal association with a cult that had mutilated and killed at least 15 people, including American pre-med student Mark Kilroy. From the moment Sara was taken into custody, authorities noted a strange split in her personality. U.S. Customs agent who assisted Mexican officials during the early days of her detention described her as having a dual personality. She was charming when the cameras were on, but when they were off, she reverted to another self, one that talked freely about murders, rituals, and demonic protection. She flipped like a switch. A source inside the Mexico City Attorney General's office added that she seemed to have three personalities: a media face which was polite, cooperative, and claiming innocence, a police face which was cold, detailed, and admitting involvement, and then a private face where she was speaking to herself, mumbling occult phrases as though trapped in a different reality. Authorities began to believe that Sara's identity had fractured under the psychological weight of her indoctrination, possibly influenced by trauma, guilt, and sustained exposure to cult conditioning. But there were also speculation that this split was deliberate, a tool to manipulate the interrogation process. In her first statements, Sara flatly denied any involvement in the cult's crimes. She told investigators she had been kidnapped by Constanzo, held against her will, and forced to watch as he and his followers committed horrific acts. "I don't know anything about the murders until I saw them on TV," she told interrogators. She pointed to a note she had tossed from a window days earlier, begging someone to call the police and claiming a woman was being held hostage. To some, this appeared to support her story, but investigators saw inconsistencies. She had remained in hiding with Constanzo for weeks, traveling with him from safe house to safe house, helping him evade capture. When asked about her nickname, La Madrina, Sara shrugged it off as a joke or a misunderstanding. But cult members, including Serafin and El Dewey, had already named her as second in command, and Constanzo's journals referred to her as his spiritual partner and priestess, not a prisoner, as the pressure mounted. Mexican police produced overwhelming physical and testimonial evidence. There were photographs of Sara participating in rituals at Rancho Santa Elena. Her fingerprints were found on ritual objects and weapons. Her name was all over Constanzo's ledger books that he used to track sacrifices and rituals. There were several eyewitnesses, accounts of her supervising ceremonies and chanting. Her handwriting was found in spiritual texts recovered at the ranch. Faced with this, Sara began to shift her narrative. She admitted to witnessing some rituals, but claimed she had no idea they would result in human deaths. She said she thought the sacrifices were symbolic or animal-based, and only realized later that humans were being killed. But then came a more chilling twist. Under the right questioning, she began to detail the rituals in gruesome clinical language. She explained how the Nganga, the ritual cauldron, was fed blood and brains. She described the chants the spirits invoked and how Constanzo sodomized victims before death as part of an energy transfer. She explained that fear and pain intensified the spiritual potency of the offering. They had to die screaming, she said at one point, echoing Constanzo's mantra. That wasn't just a confession, it was a declaration of belief. She believed in what they had done. She had not only participated, she had also internalized the ritual logic. During further sessions, Sara was asked directly about Mark Kilroy. At first, she denied knowing anything, but investigators were already aware that Mark had been held captive for hours before being murdered, meaning Sara had time to see and interact with him. Pressed further, she admitted that she saw Mark alive at the ranch. She claimed it was Constanzo who killed him, striking his head with a machete and removing his brain. When asked what her role was, she said, "I prepared the altar. I chanted with the others. I didn't touch him." However, cult members had already testified that Sara blessed the Nganga before Kilroy's brain was added and had declared the sacrifice successful. This cast doubt on her minimized role and strengthened the case that she was spiritually complicit in Kilroy's death. Sara's statements were used to help secure charges of homicide, criminal association, and occult-related crimes, and they were able to connect Constanzo's Miami-based ritual practices with those at Rancho Santa Elena. They determined the command hierarchy, placing Sara near the top of the cult structure. Despite her partial cooperation, prosecutors pushed for full accountability. Though her defense argued that she had been brainwashed or manipulated, the court saw her intellectual capacity, her leadership role, and ritual knowledge as evidence of intentional participation. Though there were signs of dissociation, Sara never underwent a full psychiatric evaluation during her initial legal processing. Some observers believed she displayed symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome or spiritual psychosis. Others saw a calculating woman who played whatever role would keep her alive. In the years that followed, she continued to deny full guilt, saying in interviews, "I never killed anyone. I never practiced black magic. I was caught in something beyond me." But her own words in the interrogation rooms when the cameras were off told a different story. Sara's interrogation revealed a woman fractured between who she once was and who she had become. Her calm explanations of horrific acts, her fluctuating denials, and her spiritual rationalizations painted the portrait of a person who had surrendered morality for power, faith for fear, and identity for indoctrination. Her confessions were not just admissions of guilt. They were a map of her transformation from honor student to high priestess of death. In that room, La Madrina did not cry. She conjured, she calculated, and ultimately she confessed without remorse. In the late 1980s, Mexico operated under a Napoleonic post-style system where judges, not juries, made final rulings, and trials were often held in closed chambers with little public access or transparency. These courts were not equipped to deal with ritualistic cult-based crime. Mexican law had no legal framework for dealing with religious cults that practiced ritual human sacrifice. The courts had to treat the murders as gang-related homicides, stripping away the occult context that defined the crimes. As some of the confessions were extracted under duress or torture, they were rendered inadmissible or contestable in court. Other confessions were heavily influenced by media pressure, leading to claims of bias and procedural violations. The press, especially American tabloids and TV programs like Geraldo, saturated the public with sensational images and stories. This made it nearly impossible to find impartial judges or legal personnel influenced by the public narrative, and there were cross-border jurisdiction issues. Since Mark Kilroy was an American citizen murdered in Mexico, the US authorities pushed for extradition, but Mexican law forbade the extradition of citizens for capital crimes unless the death penalty was waived. This was a contentious issue at the time. Despite these obstacles, Mexico pushed forward with prosecutions. The cultists were tried in batches over the course of multiple years, and many cases were separated based on the location of the crime or the identity of the victim. At the end of the trials in 1990, Sara Aldrete was first convicted of criminal association and sentenced to 6 years. Then, in 1994, she was tried again, this time for multiple homicides committed at Rancho Santa Elena. She was convicted and sentenced to 62 years in prison. She was acquitted of involvement in Constanzo's death, which occurred in the Mexico City shootout. However, the court found her culpable in the ritual killings of Mark Kilroy and several other victims. El Dubi confessed to killing Constanzo and Quintana at their request, and was convicted of double homicide and sentenced to 35 years in prison. Other cult members, Jorge and Juan, were convicted of the murder of Raul Esquivel, and each received 35-year sentences. Another member by name Omar Oria was due to be sentenced but had died of AIDS-related complications. Elio Hernandez and his 20-year-old nephew Servin were found to be key drug traffickers in the cult and were sentenced to 67 years each. They were all held in maximum security Mexican prisons due to the high-profile and gruesome nature of the case. I find it bizarre that despite the testimonies and confessions, the maximum sentence for murder was 35 years regardless of how many people that person killed, while for drug smuggling, it's almost double that. Mexico, however, had abolished the death penalty in 2005, and they've even undergone radical changes over the past 35 to 40 years, which means had the cult been tried today, probably they would have received harsher sentences, but this means they had the death penalty at the time of trying and sentencing the cult, So why were none of them executed? While the cult's most active members were captured and sentenced, the legal process revealed deep fractures in the Mexican justice system. The case exposed the lack of legal tools to address organized occult violence, the influence of public pressure on legal decisions, the limitations of international legal cooperation, and last of all, the inefficacy of evidence collected under torture. The trials ended in convictions, but many felt that true justice remained elusive. The full network behind the cult was never dismantled. The source of their ideological power, twisted belief systems, weaponized for greed and control, was never put on trial. And as long as that belief lingers in the shadows, so too does the legacy of La Madrina and her blood-stained altar. In prison, Sara preoccupies her time teaching English to prison inmates and is on the volleyball team. In an interview, she revealed her interest in witchcraft stemmed from her childhood experiences. The United States expressed a strong interest in extraditing Sara and other cult members to face charges for the murder of Mark Kilroy, a US citizen. However, Mexico denied extradition, citing sovereignty laws and the possibility of the death penalty in Texas, which was not permissible under Mexican law at the time. As at the time of posting this vlog, the United States still has open warrants on Sara and others, meaning they could face immediate arrest if ever released or deported. Between 1987 and 1989, 74 unsolved ritual killings were reported in Mexico City alone. Many of them, especially those involving children or infants, were never solved. Investigators believe Constanzo's cult may be linked to at least 23 confirmed murders and possibly more. But due to the lack of physical evidence, chaotic records, and fear among witnesses, many cases were dropped or, to this day, remain cold. Even behind bars, Sara and others have reportedly maintained spiritual influence, with rumors of coded letters, ritual instructions, and even attempts to write books or contact followers on the outside. In a chilling prison interview, Sara admitted, "I don't think the religion will end with us. They have found a temple in Monterrey that isn't even related to us. It will continue." Sara María Aldrete's journey from honest student to high priestess of death is a chilling reminder of how power, when cloaked in spirituality, can corrupt completely. She was once admired for her discipline and intelligence, but ambition without moral grounding made her vulnerable to darkness. Under Constanzo's influence, she embraced a world where murder was sacred and cruelty was a calling. One time at a time, her soul was traded for a false sense of control. At Rancho Santa Elena, lives were offered to spirits that demanded agony, and she called it devotion. The rituals were brutal, the logic twisted, but to the cult, every scream was a step closer to invincibility. When the truth surfaced, it was not through divine reckoning, but through the persistence of grieving families and determined investigators. The justice system struggled to process the horror, sentencing those it could, and burying the rest beneath red tape and unsolved files. The question remains, how does someone lose their humanity so completely, so willingly? When belief is severed from conscience, even the devout can become the damned. And when morality is silenced by loyalty, evil doesn't need to hide, it gets invited. For Mark, his memory lives on in the Mark Kilroy Foundation, founded by his parents to promote youth education, faith, and drug awareness. Mark didn't die in vain. His story became a blinding spotlight that forced evil out of the shadows.